Hello everybody. I realize I stand between coffee and all of you, so that is taken in mind. My name is Robert Boenish. I'm a postdoc at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm over the moon excited today to talk about my current project, or one of my current projects, looking at a more global perspective of changes in crustacean wild capture fishery landings. Now, to give just a little bit of background of the trajectory of world wild capture fisheries, I'm going to first note that I'm not going to touch on aquaculture today, simply because of time. There are a lot of arguments in the literature about the status of wild capture fisheries in the world, shown in orange here. Have they been declining? Are they stagnant? Maybe they're increasing. And the attention is basically, since 1990, have we plateaued, or what is happening? Now, there's no question that there's been large human impact of marine ecosystems. When I say global fisheries, I truly mean global fisheries. If you are on a continental shelf, pretty much anywhere in the world, there is probably some fishing pressure. And if you're in a major ocean basin, probably some fishing pressure, with very few exceptions. Now, through that, we have, beyond just catching and eating fish, we have fundamentally changed certain ecosystems. This is a figure from a paper Sawalski et al. In 2017, where they looked at the East China Sea and basically asked the question, how can China maintain high catches with ridiculously high fishing effort year after year after year? And based on their ecosystem length-based model, they suggest that fishing was to such an extent that it caused severe regime shifts, and more or less you have mesopredator release dynamics going on. So you remove the predators and you allow opportunities for the more weedy, more fast-growing productive species to take over. And the carrying capacity thus can change for the weedy species, can be 5-6 times higher than it was before. Now, kind of the backdrop for all of this, all these fisheries things we talk about, is climate change. And it has been mentioned by a lot of people, and will be mentioned by a lot of people, that the impacts of climate change are complex and depend on intrinsic biological characteristics of organisms and extrinsic drivers, basically ecology, and aren't just black and white. But we do know anecdotally and from some studies that the mean temperature of catch global marine fisheries has increased in recent years. As has been said many times, there are certainly going to be climate winners and losers. If you're an organism and you can make it to deeper water, or maybe you can shift poleward, that can be a good thing. If you can't, well, shucks, you're gonna have to do your best. This is a figure from Chung et al. 2010 talking about changes in catch potential, saying things are gonna get deeper. Now, there's been a lot of global studies for a lot of different things, and one of the biggest blind spots I'm going to kind of bring up today is decapod crustaceans. Currently, they make up about 8% of global fisheries, and they're worth a lot of money, and there's a lot of really interesting things about crabs, shrimp, and lobster, but they're woefully understudied on the global scale. The outline of this talk is going to talk about global patterns. I'll break it down to regional patterns, and then what I think is some explanation, some kind of mechanism. And then I'll close the talk by talking about some of the main implications with a global rise in crustaceans. Now, I mentioned there's some debate as to whether fisheries have declined since around 1990. Interestingly enough, since 1990, crustaceans shown in blue, or kind of the greenish blue color in the middle, have increased faster than every other major group of wild fisheries globally, followed by cephalopods, and there's definitely some mix. There's winners and losers among this, but they come out very far ahead. In fact, if you take out crustaceans from the world capture fisheries from 1990 to 2016, about as far as the FAO will go, you find that statistically, wild capture fisheries are declining. Further, if you remove China, which is often very controversial in the global conversation of fish statistics, you find that it doesn't matter if you include crustaceans or not, global fisheries are declining. A lot of people don't trust China, and that's to some extent fair. I do work in China. But the overall patterns of what's increasing and what's decreasing remain relatively the same. Despite China existing or not, you have crustaceans outpacing everything else. Now, breaking this down into the four major groups of crustaceans: crab, shrimp, lobster, and king crab, kind of annumer and decapods, you find it's pretty interesting. With or without China, which is orange or yellow, you find more or less linear increases dating back all the way to 1950, and they're just that much higher with the inclusion of China. But these trends are robust. In fact, looking through different regions of the world, through the different ocean basins on the left, total crustacean landings are increasing more or less linearly across the entire board. Now, there's a lot of changes, particularly in South America. You have the Humboldt current changes, you have lots of El Nino, La Nina effects. But when you break it down by continent, you find crustaceans are actually increasing just about everywhere. The only exception is Oceania, but Oceania is responsible for about 1% of global fishery landings, so I'm going to make the argument it doesn't matter too much for today's talk. Crustaceans are on the rise. Now, here's kind of an interesting dual case study. You probably, in some point of your careers, have heard a lobster talk where cod have been declining in the Gulf of Maine and lobster have been increasing. It's a classic story, kind of removal of top-down control, and that's shown in the right, where you have Atlantic cod biomass declining and lobster increasing. But if we cross the Atlantic and look at Norway, some of my colleagues have a paper in press, and they found, very interestingly, the exact same thing going on, almost a direct facsimile, but with different characters. There's an introduced red king crab species, which the Russians planted in 1960 and has kind of taken over Norway, coming from the north, and in the south you have the edible crab, Cancer pigurus, moving up. Basically, top-down pressure is giving rise to crustaceans, and we see this all over the world. And actually a more globally important species, the blue swimming crab, which is harvested by about 16 countries, way more than lobster is harvested. You have a lot of different fishery regimes, you have a lot of different exploitation histories, and so what I did here is I looked at FAO catch records and normalized each country to kind of the percentile of its own maximum catch. And what I found is quite striking. There's pretty consistent increases across the board, and in 2016, out of the 16 countries, the average percentile of catch in relation to their own max is about 80, meaning that these are everywhere from Israel to China to Australia are on the rise. There's lots more case studies, but I only picked a few here today. So the question is, why is this happening? Are there some intrinsic characteristics to crustaceans that are facilitating their success? And I thought really hard about this with some of my collaborators, and we came up with 5. I'd like to hear more or fewer if you have any afterwards. But basically, crustaceans are primed to do well in the face of change. They're feeding generalists. They can be detritivores, they can be predators, they can be scavengers. Based on a lot of meta-analyses, they have a lower temperature sensitivity and pH sensitivity than many vertebrates and invertebrates, which poses them pretty well. Next is many of them are built like tanks. They either have a tough exoskeleton or they're very cryptic. Many crustaceans, commercially viable crustaceans, are active at night. They hide very well, and they're, again, built like a tank. They grow fast, and something that's conserved over almost all crustaceans is there's a high degree of parental care and highly functional larvae. Most of the eggs are carried on pleopods through their duration. So, in addition to trying to outlay why I think there's biological characteristics crustaceans are doing well, I think there's also anthropogenic reasons that we are helping them along just about every single step of the way. And anecdotally, we find crustacean fisheries popping up and becoming very valuable, often in places where ecosystems are considered very degraded or have been serially overfished. I came up with a heuristic, kind of a conceptual map, relating enhancement from more or less prawn aquaculture to wild capture crustacean fisheries. Now, there's 4 key characteristics to consider here. The first is if you have an aquaculture, you want to decrease the predation. You want to alter the habitat to be ideal. You are going to supplement just about all of the food. And finally, you're probably going to enclose the entire reproductive cycle in the facility. Now, this sounds very different than wild capture fisheries, but in some cases, I don't think it necessarily is. For example, John Grabowski and others in the Gulf of Maine have found out that juvenile lobster are supplemented about 30 to 40% of their diet just from lobster bait. They do well in nursery grounds that are largely existing, these kelp forests, because urchins have been overfished, and as I already mentioned, Atlantic cod have been all but extirpated in a lot of the regions where lobster are doing well. But there's lots of different examples. In China, for the blue swimming crab, for example, they have juvenile stocking. There's homogenation of habitat via heavy trawl effort. And in the case of the red king crab, which was originally from the North Pacific, introduced to the North Atlantic, they're being introduced to places where they have no naturally occurring predators. So they're relatively primed for success. Now, there's a lot of implications from this. I don't know how many of you will get the reference, the Monty Python reference. Raise your hand if you get the reference. Cool, that's more than I thought. Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit, as I close this out, about economics, food security, carbon emissions, and the potential for epizootic disease as a result of an increase in crustaceans. Now, as Bob Stenick pointed out in a really cool paper called The Gilded Trap of Lobster, I think it was 2010 or 2011, with the increasing abundance of lobster, there was kind of an exodus from other fisheries in the state of Maine. The diversity of the fishermen portfolios really decreased, and it was more or less chasing the money. And this can be great. I know a lot of lobstermen. I got my PhD studying lobster in Maine. There's a lot of really nice trucks that you'll find in certain, like Stonington and other places in Maine. It brings money into small communities, but the flip side is those communities are probably going to be less resilient moving forward. If you have all your eggs in one or two baskets, if one of those baskets drops, you're in trouble. And so one of these things, because crustaceans tend to be very valuable, they're worth about 25% of global fishery landings, though only comprising about 8% of volume. There's a tendency to get overdependence on a few resources. For example, in Penobscot Bay, Maine, all these numbers, I should say, are adjusted for inflation. In 1880, the pie chart, which is the diversification of the fishermen's portfolios, had a lot of different slices you'd want. And actually, mackerel were the top netted species in Maine, which just blows my mind. And the value adjusted for inflation is about $20 million. When you move forward to 2015, in the middle of the lobster boom, almost everything is lobster in terms of value. No one is wasting time on other past important fisheries, but the flip side is the overall industry, the fishing industry, is about 16-fold more valuable. So this is tricky, and this creates really interesting incentives when you are maybe a conservationist and you want to, diversify and create social resilience. When incentives to make this much more money exist, it makes it really, really challenging. And this doesn't just play out in Maine, it plays out globally. Now, besides talking about money and talking about all of this, there's food security issues globally. Golden et al. In 2016 published a really important paper, and they found if fishery trends, wild capture fishery trends continue to 2050, there's going to be about 845 million people who are either nutrient or micronutrient deficient. That makes a big deal. That is a big deal, particularly in developing countries. So I started thinking about this. How do crustaceans stack up to other seafood? So I did an extensive literature and database research project, and you might be able to see there's cephalopods, crustaceans, demersal, and pelagic fish. Together they make up about 83% of global wild capture fisheries. And what I found in terms of the percentage yield, how much biomass is extracted from the overall organism, crustaceans are below just about everything else, except things like oysters. And when you take that biomass and you look at what's the caloric content in that biomass, crustaceans are also below the fish. These two combined, crustaceans per capita are only about 40% of the caloric content of pelagic fish, which means fewer calories. And I did a micronutrient analysis as well, but I don't have time for that today. Next, there's been, in the last year, a lot of things written about carbon emissions in wild capture fisheries. These are just a few of the papers I've seen. My favorite is from Parker et al. In 2018, and they found that overall, this is kind of surprising, crustaceans are really, really, really inefficient to capture relative to everything else. Looking at the per capita emissions intensity, so that's kilograms of CO2 per kilograms of landing, crustaceans are about 40 times worse than small pelagic fish. And when you factor in the caloric content you get from the small pelagic fish and crustaceans, the difference is about 100-fold. So this rise in crustaceans is kind of spurring and driving a change in global seafood carbon emissions. And finally, I'm just going to touch a little bit. I think there's a conversation later or talk later that's going to talk about disease. But among different invertebrate phyla, we're seeing a lot of change in distribution and density in the face of global warming. And there is some evidence from other invertebrate phyla that increased density and increasing temperature can produce a catastrophic effect. This species, Pycnopodia heliantoides, the sunflower sea star, famously declined from California to Alaska in 2013, and that coincided with a denzovirus outbreak and an ocean heat wave. From the Channel Islands in the bottom all the way up to Alaska in the top, as you look left to right through time, you see a lot of red. The dark red represents a population 1/10,000th of the previous norm. So these kind of things may become more frequent, and I would not be surprised, this is all speculation, that crustaceans, with their unprecedented increasing densities, might succumb to something similar like this. Now, to wrap this all up, there's a suite of ecological and economic reasons I think crustaceans are increasing throughout the world, and a lot of it has to do with us, and it has to do with our rise of expensive taste, the rise of the global middle class, and I don't want to sound all negative, this can be really good. This can be an economic boom, specifically for developing countries. About 69% of global crustaceans come from developing countries, and this can be a big step in industrialization. But it should not be understated that this comes with significant potential cons, both biological and social risks, not to mention increases in carbon emissions. Now with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and thank my co-authors and co-conspirators. And if there's any time for questions, I'd be happy to hear them all. Thank you.